inviting our Associate Dean Lovelace on in just a minute. But welcome everybody tonight. We're going to begin with a greeting from our Dean, the Reverend Dr. Heather Vacek.
Hello, everybody, and good evening. I'm Heather Hartung Vacek. I serve as Vice President and Dean of Lancaster Theological Seminary and Moravian Theological Seminary. And these two schools, as you may know, have now spent nearly 2 years forging a partnership and working together. Lancaster Theological Seminary's Diversity and Educational Life Committee has put together a fantastic and really important event in this evening's Theology and Queer Perspectives gathering. And we are grateful that each of you have chosen to be with us tonight. Lancaster's mission is to educate and nurture leaders to join in God's redemptive and liberating work so that all of creation may flourish. And I know that tonight's conversation serves this mission well. For further introductions and insights into the origins of tonight's conversation, I'm going to now hand things back over to Dr. Julia O'Brien, who serves at Lancaster as the Paul H. and Grace L. Stern Chair in Old Testament Studies, Professor of Hebrew Bible Old Testament, and Director of the Master of Arts in Ministry and Leadership Program. Dr. O'Brien, my thanks to you, to the Diversity and Educational Life Committee, and to these great panelists tonight.
Thank you very much. I want to add my welcome to everybody in my role as the chair of the Diversity and Educational Life Committee. It is a wonderful committee and a privilege to chair it because this is a place that brings together students, faculty, staff, and alum. And what it does is to work toward expanding opportunities for our community to live further into our commitments for inclusion and equity. This particular panel arose from a student desire to provide some programming that would bring both of our seminaries together and also to engage some intentionally liberative theologies. So I want to introduce our moderators for this evening who are going to lead us through our process tonight. The first is Rachel Compton-Monell. Rachel is a third-year Master of Divinity student at Lancaster Theological Seminary, of whom we are very proud. Working in partnership with Rachel is the Reverend Dr. Beth Toler, who is the Associate Professor of Clinical Counseling at Moravian Theological Seminary. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to our panelists for your time and your wisdom. Thank you to the moderators for being willing to facilitate our work together. And thank you too for all the participants who we can feel with us in this space. And we look forward to this opportunity to share wisdom together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O'Brien. I'm going to give a brief outline of how tonight will look so we all can have an idea of how this will go tonight. So we're going to open with a reading to give us a sense of how the application of queer theology and queer naming might look in a liturgical context. Some of you might be familiar with that in your experiences in your religious traditions, others might not be. That just gives everybody a chance to kind of see what that might look like. Then that will be followed by some opening remarks by our panelists. After that, we'll have some prepared questions that we'll pose to the panelists. And we're really hoping that that'll just kind of spark conversation among the panelists. After about half an hour of that, we'll open the floor to questions from our attendees. Our audience members, if you would place your questions in the Q&A portion, Dr. Toler will moderate those questions to the panelists in that time. After that, we'll have some closing remarks from our panelists, and then Dr. Dean Lovelace will close us out. So I believe we have a slide prepared of the text of the piece that we're going to read. Dr. Toler and I will responsively read that back and forth, feel free to participate in either the regular text or the bold if you'd like to get that kind of liturgical experience. This reading is called God is Queer, is by M. Jade Kaiser from infleshed.com.
God is queer.
As in strange, surprising, titillating, non-conforming to norms that destroy.
As in breaking open new possibilities through flesh entangled and brave acts of collective courage.
As in troubling certainties, resisting assimilation, and persisting through struggle together.
As in interdependence, chosen family, and reaching out to isolated kin.
As in always becoming.
As in less this or that, and more multi-layered, multidimensional, and complex.
As in intimately experienced and beyond definition.
As in the love between strangers and sheets, the love that lasts for lifetimes, the love that begets love.
As in resists white supremacy and all its deadening lies, rigid definitions, and desire to control and confine.
As in loyal to love, lovers, beloveds, even when it's all on the line.
As in hurtful when spit from the mouth of hate, but sometimes still also a lighthouse, a history of holy uprising and a coming home from within. Amen.
So as Dr. Moore and Rachel shared with us, we will open our panel with asking each panelist to share some opening remarks around about your work and commitments, and how did you come to those work and commitments, and what does it mean to do theology from your own queer perspective. We don't necessarily have an order, so whoever would like to start will feel free to jump in. This is almost a time where the professor says, do I have to call on somebody to start? Dr. Lightsey, would you mind?
I hope I got my microphone on. No, I don't mind. So I'll say a few things. Let me say that my work really kind of embodies, is an embodiment, is an embodied queer kind of fashion, in that it cuts across several landscapes. I am an ordained clergy person. I am the first out-ordained African-American queer lesbian elder. That's a distinction in the United Methodist Church. And that in and of itself says a lot about queering. The identification as a queer lesbian, the fact that I'm out and that I've somehow managed to keep my ordination orders, and that I do activist work against racism, sexism, and homophobia. Though within the United Methodist Church, because of its current polity that discriminates against the LGBTQ community, which is leading our church to a schism, though some people like to call it reform, I call a thing a thing. It is a schism. No sense of putting lipstick on a pig here. We're going through schism and people are disaffiliating because they do not want to see our church change into an affirming and really inclusive church. So that's one of the commitments I do as an ordained clergy person. I pastor an affirming church, which is located in the School of Theology in Hyde Park here in Chicago. I'm also a scholar who does work in really particularly in womanist and constructive theology. So I'm actually in the immediacy. I do kind of like live theology as a scholar. So I'm out on the streets, asking questions of folks, agitating for justice for Black and queer and disenfranchised people all across our nation. And I would say in other parts of this global society. And then the third area that I do my work in is as a senior administrator. I'm dean of the faculty at a Unitarian Universalist school. I happen to be, as you heard, an ordained elder. I'm a Christian. So I'm a Christian in a different kind of space who loves the interfaith work. And as an LGBTQ person, I specifically was delighted to join Meadville Lombard because of its commitment to progressive liberalism and its commitment to affirming the lives of all God's creation. I turned down invitations to work at other places because my commitments are strong. I just as soon turn down a commitment to work in an environment that was totally LGBTQ if in fact they were racist, and there are racist LGBTQ persons. So when I say my commitments are strong, they're strong in those areas. I don't know that, I think that's a pretty good touch of what I do. So.
Thank you. Dr. Whipple.
Hello, sorry, my internet went out for a brief moment, but I'm back with you all. I'm assuming we're just giving our opening introductions. First of all, it's wonderful to be with all of you, and thank you to our organizers for creating such an amazing space. I come to you as someone who works in New Testament. My focus is in New Testament and queer hermeneutics. I started this work actually from my initial work that was caused by working in intimate violence agencies and shelters in New York City. Working within these spaces, I came to see the ways in which the Bible was used as both a weapon and a source of strength and empowerment in the lives of those experiencing violence and abuse. This led me to do a lot of work in trauma. And as I was coming into understanding my own identity and engaging in work in trauma, I began working with many queer communities in New York, particularly unhomed queer youth, many of whom the Bible, Christianity, religion was used as a reason to have family members kick them out of their homes. So part of my work is really looking at the Bible, looking, yes, at texts that are death dealing, that are weaponized, that are used against queer folk, but then also looking for spaces of creative transformation in the midst of this. And as Dr. Lightsey said, doing this intersectionally, having to look at the ways in which power, race, citizenship, all of these different socioeconomic issues as well come into conversation with the lives of queer folk, and the way, especially in this country right now, we see Christians wielding the Bible in particular to basically eliminate and erase the rights of especially trans folk in our country right now. Just moments before coming on with you all, seeing and hearing from my partner what happened in Missouri, as we're seeing across many states of banning gender affirming care for youth, for individuals in their 20s, and really with aims of erasing trans populations in this country, and the way in which Christian nationalism is supporting that work. So this is something I'm particularly interested in right now. It is more acute since I have moved from New York City to Texas, working in a Marianist Catholic institution here in Texas, watching the way in which conversations about trans rights, queer rights, drag are part of lived reality, the fear that is in communities right now for us as queer folk, as we watch legislatures continue to empower homophobia, transphobia, and all of the other isms that come along with it. So my work has become increasingly more urgent of addressing the way the Bible is used in so much of this legislation, which I hope I'll get a chance to talk about later. But how do we also engage queer folk of faith in the midst of a reality where the Bible is pretty much used as a death-dealing weapon in our country currently?
Thank you so much. I have to admit, my Southern accent is afraid of mispronouncing your name. Dr. Justin Sabia-Tanis.
Hey, you got it right. This is what happens
Awesome.
when an Italian and a Dutch person get married. They
Thanks.
that was exactly right. So thank you so much. So I'm Justin Sabia-Tanis. I'm a gay trans man. I came out first in 1985 as a lady, and then transitioned in the mid 1990s. So I've been doing this work for quite a while. Right now, I'm on the faculty of United Theological Seminaries of the Twin Cities, where I direct the Social Transformation Program, which means I get to talk to people all day about how to bring greater justice into their communities. So it's an incredible gift to be able to do this particular work. As I said, I'm gay and trans. I grew up partly in the Netherlands and partly in the United States. So I also bring some broader social occasions from that. I've also been a pastor, a queer activist, as well as a scholar. So I was originally ordained in metropolitan community churches and LGBTQ affirming denomination. Now I'm with United Church of Christ, but I've pastored churches, and I was a pastor of almost exclusively gay churches during the AIDS epidemic, which really informs a great deal of my theology and my perspectives. And I've also worked as an activist doing work in LGBTQ nonprofits, including the National Center for Transgender Equality, where I worked particularly on bills to prevent hate crimes, and was part of work to pass and implement the first LGBTQ affirming federal legislation. So that was an interesting experience. I can potentially talk about that more, but I'm also really passionate not about queer issues, also about the environment. And before I came to Minnesota to be United, we were in Arizona and California, and I've done some work on the borderlands, and particularly in connecting with queer activists in El Salvador and Mexico, and doing work as a pastor on the border. So, and I have dogs, including 2 beagles, so that it's impossible to predict what sounds may come from behind me. So they're very talkative. Hopefully they'll be quiet. In terms of theology, I just want to share a couple thoughts to echo what my colleagues have shared, or to intersect with that. To me, it's really important that queer and trans theologies are ones which are grounded in and build from the real lived experiences of LGBTQ people, that are not just word games or clever ways of doing theology. This is not a trendy thing. This is not the latest fashion in religious studies. but is really a struggle for people's lives and well-being and dignity and health of transgender, non-binary, gender expansive people, queer people, gay people, lesbians, asexual people, all the permutations and creativities we come up with. And so I think the reality of those lives have to be centered. Mark Jordan, the gay theologian, said in an essay, theology is not a parlor game for courtiers. And I really, that's something that I really take to heart, although I should be careful mentioning this, because I did a panel at the AAR in which I made this declaration at the beginning of my paper, and the paper that followed was entirely an essay on word games on queer theology, and it was a little embarrassing to have led this way. But anyway, I'm going to stick my neck out there. I also think that the queer theologies have to include that we articulate and acknowledge the devastating impact of anti-transgender, anti-gay, lesbian, bisexual beliefs, attitudes, and practices that are completely exaggerated and multiplied by racism, misogyny, nationalism, and other forms of oppression. So we're doing this work in the midst of a very violent field of things happening, and we cannot forget the people who are most impacted by those things. And at the same time, we're also mindful that we're doing this theology in a space of great gains, that we've made greater acceptance. As my students reminded me today, they were talking about queer joy, and we were looking at theorists. We were talking about dance as a expression of queer theology and a form of resistance and survival. And so, we have to hold this sort of tension in all the things that do. I also think we have to center center race in our analysis for several reasons. One, have a sense of academic integrity that LGBTQ people of color have always been a part of our communities, but also if you look at the demographics, particularly of young people, soon our community will be majority young people of color. And so addressing race, addressing issues of their vulnerability is really, I think, critical for us to even be telling the truth about queer people, and the ways in which LGBTQ people of color have been instrumental to the movement for liberation and building communities to sustain themselves and others. And then the last thing I'll say is I truly believe that queer and trans liberation is for the benefit of all of humanity. Some of my straight students in my queer and trans theologies class say, but I feel liberated by this too. Like, well, that's the point, right? That we should be freed from the ways in which people are distanced from God and from the holy because of the intransigence and rejection from the church, and also the very sort of channeled and linear modes of thinking about sexuality, thinking about gender. It should be good news for all of humanity when we share our theologies.
Thank you. So we have some prepared questions for our panelists, for specific individuals, and some questions that are just more general. But our hope is, I'm speaking to our panelists right now, as you begin to share an answer to a specific question, let's imagine we're on the Sunday morning roundtable, right? The news shows. You all feel free to engage each other in conversation. Rachel and I will do our best to smoothly transition you to a different question if we feel like that's where we are. So that's where we'll move. I want to make one note. I see a couple of hands raised. If you do have questions, please use the Q&A feature on the Zoom application, and I'll be sure to get those questions and feed those to our panelists when we have the right time. And I think Dr. Sabia-Tanis, you've presented a great segue into our first question, and I'll let Rachel share that for the group.
Yeah, so when this panel was being imagined, some were calling it this work liberation theology. We've heard some of you talk about liberation. Do you define what you do as liberation theology specifically, and why or why not? And whoever would like to can start.
I'll start yet again. No tea, no shade. Yes. I mean, I hope I made that abundantly clear in my introduction. I'm sorry, it's that time of the pinging you hear, my adult children who want to run my life and are checking in on me at the end of the day. So yes, liberation, yes. If in fact liberation has to do with ensuring that persons who are marginalized are understood as being part of God's creation. If we believe, as was suggested in some of the first liberation theologians, that God has an option for the poor and the marginalized of this world, as I do, then our commitments have to be rooted in that belief. And my commitments are deeply rooted in that belief. I didn't mention that my work is just not, as you can hear, is not just contained in the church, or the academy, but my work is on the streets with the people and for the people. For instance, when I came back to Chicago, I knew that I wanted to be involved in the politics of the city, because this is how decisions are made in public policy. And so I accepted an invitation to be a member of Mayor Lori Lightfoot's LGBTQ advisory committee. That committee has done great work. Our most recent work has been to get a resolution passed and a commitment from aldermen to participate in a work called Hire Trans, #Hire Trans. And that work, that project was developed after the death of a 31-year-old Black trans woman named Elise Mallory, whose body was found in Lake Michigan. The cause of death remains unknown. We committed to working with her family and other activists to ensure that her commitment to the employment of trans folks did not die, was not squashed. And so we worked really hard to make sure we didn't just pass a cute resolution, but we wanted to pass something that would be liberative for the trans community here in Chicago. So yes. Otherwise, I mean, why do the work? The work is if it's not towards liberation.
And I would add on and agree, it's definitely liberatory work. And part of it is the fact that it's concrete. As you've both said, these aren't word games. I mean, there is a space that there is a queer theoretical space that can be engaged, certainly. And you can find queer joy in the midst of that. But if at the end of the day, you aren't looking at flesh and blood issues that people are dying, they are being killed, it doesn't work. And also, it is a self-check too within queer work that we acknowledge the privilege that is within it. The way in which certain sectors of the LGBTQ community have privilege to pass and be accepted into general society much more easily than others. So the fact that we have to do our own work too, the way in which we divide within queer theology, queer biblical hermeneutics, those who are excluded in that work. It's an internal work. It's a work in the church. It's a work in society. For me, I do a lot of work both on grassroots, but then with the United Nations, with NGOs. And many of these groups who are interested in working on issues of gender and sexuality get very, very leery when religion wants to be involved. I've been told, if organizations I work with, if Christian wasn't in the name, we could work with you. So there's a sense of also having to create counter voices within society, that there is a space of queer liberation that is working for the common good, Common goods, there is not just one. The ways in which we have to do that work is certainly liberatory, especially also dealing with, as I've said before, the death dealing aspects that are present. But I find the queer liberation work, while working through privilege, to be extremely liberatory when we're looking at it on the ground.
Yeah, I absolutely think it's liberative work. I will say, as a scholar, I struggle between liberation theology as a term being one that has a specific historical and cultural meaning. But then, I read it in Liberation Theology and Sexuality that was edited by Marcella Altos Reed. There's a great essay by the liberation theologian Otto Madura about the need of liberation theology to come the other way, to connect with queer theology and sexual theology, and expand that understanding. And so, or specifically around sexuality. And so in that way, I also take great heart from it as a living tradition in which we're interacting with one another for the liberation of humanity.
So there's a good follow-up question from the audience. I've also put it in the chat for panelists so you can read it, but I'll read it out loud. How would you say that we're to navigate and offer liberation theologically to communities that uphold some of the punitive ideologies, like in Kenya and Uganda, that have recently passed a new law to outlaw and severely penalize, to include death, those who identify as LGBTQIA+.
Shake up the order a little bit. I think one thing one strategy is to really work with folks within those communities who are, there's a strong resistance. There are groups like TFAM, the Fellowship of Affirming Ministry, has strong connections with activists. There are Christian pastors in those countries who are working very hard at liberation. So I would say one way that we offer liberation theologically is in support of those pastors as they contextualize the global conversations we're having about queer liberation. And I think work like Adrian Van Klinken's Kenyan Christian and Queer really, sorry, I'm sounding like a book dispenser, but that's okay. Dad was a librarian, so I can live with that. But stories like that there's an African Christian reader, that really tell the stories of that we seek to understand what it means to live in those contexts, and also to recognize the deep theology, beautiful poetry, art, things that are coming out as people in those countries seek their own liberation, and ask ourselves, in what way can we support ministries, community organizations, and other things that allow those people to thrive in their context, and let them lead us about how we might liberate, because that is the methodology of liberation theology.
Yeah, and I would also say, I'll just add some names to the scholars that you pointed out, some boots on the ground, and that's at TFAM, Reverend Joseph Talton, who's doing magnificent work in that area. Reconciling Ministries has also been over in, I'm forgetting the country that they were in Africa, doing some of that work also. It's very important that I just put an accent on what you said, Justin. It's very important to work with the community. I've learned as an activist that there are ways that we can enter into a community rather paternalistically, and we are not trying to be little messiahs to any community, because we have our own stuff that we need to work out. And I say that as a Black woman, I would not go into any country in Africa, one, uninvited and without some serious connections, because I have, I have my own stuff to work out, and I also have privileges that I have to be aware of whenever I'm working in a community outside my own community. So I don't make assumptions. That's another thing. Don't make the assumption that just because you yourself are a member of the United States LGBTQ community, that you have rights and privileges all over the globe. You don't. In fact, I would say we need to tread more cautiously in those areas because we come from the United States and because we carry our own privileges.
And I just want to echo that as well, especially increasing work in trauma theory, the ways in which we often want to implement Euro-American understandings of how to fix problems. We want to have certain ideas around legislature, around medicating, around all of these different things that often remove ideas of how communities and cultures want to process intergenerational and acute trauma. So I think the more we can support those who are doing this work and do our own work, the better.
Yeah, and if I could just add one thing onto what my colleagues have shared, it's also being responsive to things people specifically ask for. So there is a request for queer and trans theology books, for example, for people who want to read what folks in the West are saying and then create their own theologies, or use our work as a springboard, or as a, when people request those things, I've made books available to people in other countries. And there has also been a request through TFAM, from pastors in some of these areas who are unable to get any theological education near their home countries, but are required to get that in order to be certified, for example, as a chaplain or be registered with the government as a clergy person. And they're looking for that and finding ways that we can offer that in a way that's through distance education and affordable, is something that is an active challenge I'm working on now, and would love to work with other folks who might want to do that. But that's their request to be able to access our institutions in order to get credentials that they need at home that they can't get. And so when folks ask us for that, I also feel like we should, part of being a positive global force for liberation is doing our best to respond to those requests in a way that's meaningful. So.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Here, because the question identifies the danger. And I just want to accent that there is danger that African LGBTQ persons face in several countries. And so our commitment to justice cannot be naively moved. You can't naively do that. We have to be very careful about what we might want to send, because just having particular items could really cause harm to certain people. So I said once again, we really have to be careful to make sure we're working through the right channels.
Just there was an acronym that was used. I would like to clarify for the audience. TFAM is the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, just so you can have that for your resources. And Dr. Lightsey, I'm sorry, the way it's working out, you're going to be put on the spot here again to go first for our next question. You have recently written a chapter in a book of collected chapters your chapter is called "I'm Black, I'm queer, lesbian, I'm Methodist, I'm thriving, and I love the last word, irregardless." My question about that is how does this intersectional perspective impact and push the boundaries of both queer theology and Black theology? And also, if you kind of shared some things at the beginning already, but what further thoughts or insights would you want to share with us about the way in which the UMC is approaching and dealing with LGBTQ issue?
In no particular order, let me say that we've been working on justice for LGBTQ persons within the United Methodist Church for several decades now. And so it was my pleasure to write that chapter, although using that word irregardless was met with some resistance by the publisher's editor. And it's the petty side of me coming out. I'm sharing this because I had to actually fight to make sure that that word was included. And I actually had to teach this white straight man that there was a reason I was using that word, a cultural reason that I was using that word, and that it was in fact a word. It troubled me that this editor thought that, just the arrogance of it, as though I don't really pay attention to my vocabulary when I'm writing any kind of scholarly anything. I pay attention to it on Facebook when I'm writing there. So I had to push for that because it was a cultural matter. It strengthened my resolve to write the work in the way that I wrote the work, with accessibility for folks. And I think that if we're going to do this work, it has to be accessible beyond the academy. We have to unpack the language. As Mother Ruby Sales says, we have to unpack our tongue that is often also colonized. So I wanted to make sure that my work could be accessible. You asked me something else, and I hope I'm fully answering your question, but I've been mentored somewhat by James Cone, who taught me I can answer a question any way I want to answer.
Yeah, you can. Absolutely. I think the initial question was, how does your intersectional perspective also impact and push the boundaries of both queer and Black theology?
Yeah. Within it's I've been writing for years about homophobia within Black communities and communities of color. I write it with the understanding that Black persons have embraced a kind of Western theological perspective that has not been healthy for us as a people, and certainly has not been healthy to us as a worshiping community. So I've been trying to, one, disabuse Black folk of the idea that homosexuality is a white man's disease. Okay, that's a kind of Black nationalism that has not been helpful for us. And so in my work itself, I've taken the time to go through historical items that show that there have been queer loved ones in Africa since antiquity. And I have been careful in my work also not to call a person, not to identify a people or a person in ways that they themselves have not. Because I've found that within the LGBTQ community, we can be so thirsty for other folks to come out, particularly when it comes to like people who are considered as stars, that we call them queer before they call themselves queer. We have the headline, we have the story, we have everything. And that is especially the case within the LGBTQ community. I'm forgetting the man that they really wanted to call queer, and he hadn't called himself queer. And so I kept telling the members of the Black community, no, you can't call him what he has not called himself. And you really need to think about what it is that this man is actually saying. So I'm careful within the Black community to help us to identify ways of being with one another that have a sense of integrity with it. But I'm also clear within the African American community to speak out against homophobia within our churches, which is rampant. And also within the community itself, which has led to a lot of the toxic masculinity among Black men that leads to the murder of Black trans women. So that work is something that's been really important for me.
And as a United Methodist doing this work, which you also clearly claim in this particular chapter, it struck me, and I will confess that I am the outsider, peeking in on the United Methodist campaign of BUMC, right? And as I've done a little bit of a deep dive in that, it seems like the primary narrative is we're a big tent. And I'm just curious how you see that narrative as that predominant narrative intersecting with, is this really helping queer theology, the plight of queer people, or non-queer people for that matter? How do you view that narrative?
The acronym BUMC, are you talking about the Black United Methodist Church? Or?
No, it's a hashtag that has come up around the conversations around whether or not congregations are discerning whether or not to stay or go.
BUMC.
BUMC.
Oh, I'm not aware of that hashtag, so I apologize. Some things I protect my spirit against. And so all the ugliness that's coming up right now, I tended to protect myself, but I know that the LGBTQ community has been used as scapegoats by the conservative right-wing evangelicals within the United Methodist Church for quite some time. And recently we recognized, and our bishops have begun to recognize, that the real deal was about power and control and property grabs. And we were just in the way of it all anyway. And I am one who's quite happy with the schism. I celebrate the schism because for so many years myself and others like me had been told, why don't you just leave the church? Well, no, this is my church also. And so rather than LGBTQ persons leaving in large numbers, which they were, what we're finding is that members of the conservative right wing of our church are leaving. Bishops have been part of the schism, particularly down in Texas and in Florida, taking many churches out of the denomination. I'm probably saying too much about this, but I celebrate their leaving. I'm like, bye-bye. So because it's going to, I think the end result, I pray the end result will be a healthier church. And sometimes, as I teach my students, the church must die in order to live. And I think we're seeing some pockets of death within the United Methodist Church as an institution, so that the body of Jesus Christ, the Church of Jesus Christ, can live.
Anyone want to respond to that, or can move on?
Okay, well, our next question is for you, Dr. Sabia-Tanis. What has developed over the years in regard to trans inclusivity in ministry context? And does queer theology play a role in these developments? You're mute.
That's not a real Zoom call. Someone doesn't actually say muted. So I thought a lot about the pairing of these questions, and I have to say my conclusion is sadly that I think trans inclusion in the church has a lot more to do with cultural and political forces than it has to do with theology. And here's what I mean by that. If you look back about 20, 25 years ago, trans activists made a very intentional decision in this country to ally themselves with gay and lesbian organizations. So when organizations started calling themselves LGBTQ or LGBT, people said, all right, if you're going to throw the T on the end, then we're going to make a decision about whether you're going to hold your feet to the fire about that being for real. Interestingly, at about the same time, intersex activists made a different decision, which is why in US trans organizing and theology, you see a lot less conversation about intersex issues than you do in global contexts. But I would say the church largely followed these trends. And so the Open and Affirming Coalition of the UCC or other groups felt the same pressures to be inclusive. Nobody did it instantly, whereas conservative groups that already rejected homosexuality then were free to reject trans people, which is not true theologically across religions and countries either. But the decision here, I think I see more ramifications from that. So we have seen, of course, quite a bit of change in the inclusion of transgender people, and I think for the role of queer theology, most of the people who initially wrote about transgender theology, myself included, were first involved in queer theology and then became involved. And so I would say that my desire to write queer theology that does not apologize, doesn't care, in a sense, what the wider world thinks about it, stemmed from my work in queer theology and my experiences in metropolitan community churches, where you could be exactly who you are. You did not need to be ashamed of, apologize, struggle with. I was raised in a very progressive Christian household, so I'm never worried about going to hell. And so I think, there was, whereas some other people like Virginia Mollenkott came from a very evangelical background, and so included some of that in their theology, but grounded first in queer theology. Vicki Kolakowski, who was one of the first people to write with any theological training. Remember, Virginia Mollenkott was not a trained theologian. Vicki had MDiv from Pacific School of Religion, or she still does. She's now working as a judge, right? But she wrote some of the first books that really compared eunuchs or first essays that compared trans people and eunuchs, and really began to draw these links, came out of queer theology. So I think some of that theology certainly emerged, and we saw primarily the advocacy for trans inclusion in ordination that flowed from, and sometimes learned from the mistakes of the movement for gay and lesbian ordination. That is, avoid study panels at all possible costs, except in the case of Erin Swenson in the Presbyterian Church. She transitioned after she was ordained. They did I was raised Presbyterian, so we love those things. And they did an extremely thoughtful decision to uphold her ordination. But by and large, let's avoid the politics of large bodies voting on our ability to be ordained. Let's avoid study commissions that go on endlessly, as a way of putting off decision-making about people's ordinations. So, we certainly see that. I think we also, one of the things that Mark Jordan points out in that essay, In Search of Queer Theology Lost, that I mentioned at the beginning, he points out that one challenge for queer theology is that a lot of it has been written in anthologies, and that's certainly true of trans theology. It's a chapter in a queer theology book. I think we're in need of more book length, in-depth theologies in those ways, so we could learn from that area of queer theology as well. But in more recent times, I think we're polarizing into deeper levels of outright rejection of non-binary and trans children and youth from certain communities, which is plays into and is reflected by the legislation. And we've seen more. I've been to 3 children's sermons in the last year in Minnesota, where the pastor talked about trans and non-binary people as children of God and explained that to the children of the church in a children's sermon, something which I, as a child, could not have in my wildest dreams ever imagined would be a thing. And I would say in my previous life as a coaster, first East Coast and then West Coast, I did not imagine was happening in the Midwest, right? And these are all joyful sermons about how we can accept, if there are kids in the Sunday school who are non-binary and trans, these are the pronouns we use for them, and this is why God loves them, and like God loves all of us. And so, I guess the bottom line is, I think if a church sees inclusion as a value now, they're often striving towards including non-binary and trans people. And if they see sexuality as a sin, then they'll reject. I think, just one last point, I think we need strong theological work on that divide. And we particularly need work on the ethics in places where legislators and pastors are in the face of overwhelming information about the harm they're doing to trans and non-binary kids. And they continue to deliberately do that harm. That is an ethical issue. It's not an ethics of what the trans or non-binary people should do. It's the ethics of harming young people. on purpose when all of the evidence is presented to you that you are doing harm and continuing to do it. And that's, I hope that the work that we've done, there's a little work done on the ethics of heterosexism and homophobia. And I think we need to do more of that kind of work of really calling into critique those damaging practices.
I think to piggyback on what you're sharing there, and this, we can open this up for all three of you as well, is a question from the audience about how to create basic education of the parishioner on the street, terms like queer, LGBTQ, trans, etc. And wondering about how the basic understanding of how everyone becomes aware of their own identity could be helpful in helping other people come to respect each other. So this is a little bit of the praxis of that you were just speaking to, Dr. Sabia-Tanis. So I don't know how others would talk about how do we cross that divide and get more into into congregations with education with those kinds of things.
I know of one group that's doing it real well here in Chicago called Pride in the Pews. They're not-for-profits that are LGBTQ affirming. Their members are LGBTQ. They have commitments and they are trained to go into churches. And I'm really emphasizing trained, because I think you need to be trained to go into churches. The desire alone is not enough. I've seen people who've been in church spaces who've tried to do this kind of definitional kind of work and really flop all over the place. And it's because they don't have the training and the ongoing training. I teach queer theology, and I'm always learning something new from students. I mean, as far as terms are concerned, you don't learn a term and that's it, or 5 terms and that's it. It's changing all the time. And I'm in my classroom clutching my pearls quite often with the things that the students are teaching me and loving it. And we're learning together. And so I think you need to be trained in order to do that work. I don't know, I guess some basic stuff, but there are going to be questions that come up. And for instance, if you go to a Black church space, all the questions that come up, you need to be trained. And you need to have some cultural competency also. So it's not just about the terms themselves, because how do you, in my context, how do you teach about terms like transgender? How do you break that down in a way that the church mother can understand? There's a cultural dynamic to it. And if you think you're just going to go in with some science and some theology and do that kind of training, I'm here to disabuse you of that.
And I would agree. I think it's great to see spaces like Lancaster and Moravian, who, I've been able to come to Lancaster and teach queer hermeneutics, have conversations about how do we preach? How do we look at wording of hymns? How do we do this work? But that it cannot be solo. It has to be a community resource project, in that you're finding out who is trained in your community to help. Who can you bring in? Who are your dialogue partners as you're trying to integrate this fully within congregational settings? And I think a really important thing is, as Dr. Sabia-Tanis talked about, this idea of how do we often talk to our youth? So often people want to just start with adults and not talk to children and youth, who legislation is increasingly seeking to take education out of schools, take out the rights for bodily autonomy. So to be able to also think through this and to understand developmentally how we have these conversations is essential as we do this, but congregations on their own can't do it alone.
Yeah, I'd also name the denominational advocacy groups often have good training on this. so I want to agree with everything my colleagues have said. I also note in teaching queer and trans theologies that sometimes the terms have changed by the end of the semester. So what does it mean, how do we help our communities of faith radically walk, in humanizing others? So whatever the term arises, they approach that with curiosity, with love, with respect for the dignity of that human being. And so I think while there definitely needs to be specialized work and training to be done in some of that, can the Christian church follow in the footsteps of Jesus in terms of treating each person with a radical sense of love? That goes a long way to whatever the issue is that you're trying to address. And if we have that foundation in our churches, not one of dismissal or schooling people who disagree with you, or any of this sort of facets, then we're better prepared to accept that training or to accept that person who walks through the doors of our congregation. And I really worry for our country that we have, and for our communities of faith, that we have walked away from that grounding in profound respect for the people around us in this divided country.
And I think that's so important, this idea of rehumanizing, and also this idea of leaning into the imago Dei, that if we are going to see the dynamic understanding of identities, of relationality constantly evolving, that we could approach that with excitement, in that we're also learning new ways of understanding God, that God is not static, God is expansive. And by ensuring that we are radically loving and humanizing those who our society seeks to dehumanize, we're also learning more about this deity that is bringing these communities together.
And Dr. Whipple, this is a good segue into a question for you. Can you expand on what you're talking about, and in particular, say a little bit about what you believe the role of biblical interpretation has in that venture that you've just proposed to us?
Definitely. I've felt a deeper sense of urgency than I probably ever have of the importance of biblical interpretation being part of this conversation, and particularly for the reasons my colleagues have talked about as far as what is happening in this country. The Bible is being weaponized by white supremacist and Christian nationalist groups in ever increasing ways to shape legislative practices in this country. Just as an example, I don't know if you have all heard about the Millstone Acts that were put forth in Oklahoma, South Carolina, and sent replications through multiple states. These acts, for example, the one in South Carolina that went before the state legislature, was seeking to prohibit any healthcare professionals from providing referrals for gender affirming care and procedures for anyone who is under the age of 26. And that no public funds could go towards this, with threat of penalties and charges for those who did not follow this act. Well, the name for the Millstone Act came from Matthew 18:6. The verse, you've got a New Testament person here, so of course a little Bible's going to come in, is, if any of you cause one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depth of the sea. We are seeing this in our legislature, the way in which the Bible gets used, cherry-picked, as we have seen. They don't want to talk about what was before this, that Jesus is talking to people about how to be a part of the kingdom of God. And they say you need to be humble like children. You need to care for the children, when acts like the Millstone Acts are doing the absolute opposite. So for me, the part of biblical interpretation, I always talk about this in my career hermeneutics class. Some of it is addressing the ways in which texts are twisted and skewed. We have to address things like the clobber passages that get used. But I spend a majority of my time, in addition to doing that, to looking at what is life-giving about doing queer hermeneutics within biblical texts, the ways in which we find new connections to God, to relationality. And this isn't just going, some people think it's a scavenger hunt for where are the queer folk in the Bible? No, it's more than that. It's looking at relationality. It's looking at the ways we engage one another, and what it means to bring about the kingdom of God here, now, the way we see in each other the imago Dei, the way also we see a different way of being society. I think we talk about how do we work within the societies, the cultures we're in, but a real benefit of queer theology, queer hermeneutics is that breaking forth too, the breaking down of boundaries to say we can actually live in community in new ways, in more just ways, that hold space for multiplicity as opposed to an increasing narrowing death dealing singularity that in this country is being put forth through legislatures day after day right now.
This is why, if I may, this is why I think you really cannot do this work without a kind of interdisciplinary approach. Because this use of the Bible is historically is not new. Okay. The Bible has, in this country, has always been the resource for oppression. Therefore, you have the medicalization of deviance based upon text in the Bible. Why would a slave how could a slave be in their right mind and run away? Therefore, they must be suffering from drapetomania. The Black codes that were put into place using scripture to legislate against Black people running away, against Black people speaking inappropriately to white people, Jim Crow and Jane Crow, and the resurgence of Jim Crow 2.0. All of these things are not disconnected from one another. They're all connected to one another, which is why I can't do my work in queer theology without having it framed from my lens as a womanist, as a Black person, without looking at history as alongside the text, and looking at, for me, at slave narratives also, to see the horrors that have been placed on people, that people have had to go through while people resource the Bible, Hebrew Bible and New Testament, to do their dastardly deeds. It has to be interdisciplinary, or for me, it's not really queer theology if it's not interdisciplinary.
No, most certainly. And the way that this is a continued cycle of how the Bible gets used for oppression. And I think that is a benefit of doing queer work, is how do we also put those disruptions in this cycle to say, we've got to care about the way this gets used and pits marginalized groups continually against each other, that the Bible's coming after trans folk today. But if we don't also look at how the Bible is used in systemic racism in this country, we can't have the conversation. So part of that work is acknowledging, seeing also the funding that goes behind creating these biblical interpretations. White Christian nationalist money is there in ways that we've consistently seen through this society. So how do we actually address that and use queer resources of queer theology, queer hermeneutics as part of that work?
Okay, we're going to go into audience questions now, and we'll supplement if they start getting sparse. Dr. Toler, do you want to introduce our first question?
Sure.
And audience members, if you want to start contributing more questions, you're free to do so now.
Sure. So our first question is, first, an acknowledgement and appreciation for the conversation on the intersection between queer theology and post-colonial perspectives. The question is, in a similar vein, do you see the work of queer theology trying to legitimize the queer community according to dominant norms, or is it about establishing an entirely new set of norms? If they're new norms, could you provide an example? I'll put it in the chat as well.
Since I lectured on this morning, maybe I'll volunteer to go first.
Go for it.
I think I think we're at a critical junction about whether the goal of our theologies is to assimilate, legitimize, or to revolutionize. And I think, when I was younger and came out, the idea of, I somewhere in the basement, I have a bumper sticker that says, "I don't support gay marriage. I don't believe in that lifestyle." We were going to dismiss the whole heteropatriarchy and so forth. Now I've had a partner who died. I ministered during the AIDS epidemic. I know that in a society that values legal marriage, that being able to be at someone's bedside at critical junctures is a precious, precious gift that I wouldn't give away, right? So I think we can't, when people lost their homes because they didn't have the ability to inherit from their partners, like, we can't be naive about the importance of some of these political junctures, or about the value in, I babysit my neighbor's kids, right? And in a random street, in a random suburb in the Midwest, something that would not have happened 30 years ago, except in very rare cases. And so I think there's ways in which being part of the broader community is of value to us, to be seen as part of one humanity, to have the same legal rights that people have in order to protect our loved ones. These are valuable. At the same time, this is potentially, at the same time, I think the system is not working for people. Not only are there almost no one man plus one woman is married in the Bible, but there's fewer and fewer of those in our society, right? So the system is not serving us well, and I think needs some revolutionizing. We look at the history of peoples of Africa, of the Americas, of all around the Pacific Islands, all around the world, and we see examples of multiple configurations in different cultures of different ways of understanding gender in complex and fascinating ways. We see different configurations by which people formed intimate relationships, chose sexual partners, all of these kinds of things. And this is potentially a wacky theory of mine, but I wonder if the emergence of the kind of diversity we see among young people around the world, in our country, but other places as well, and the post-colonial reclaiming of those earlier traditions is really humanity returning to a more a state that we once had, that's been systematically destroyed by the colonizers of the church, and so. Fighting for thinking about the 60s and 70s calls from queer spiritual activists for a world in which people are free to fall in love with, to have sex with the people that they choose, regardless of if it's not harming others, why not? And to select the gender expression, the gender identity that is the one that is right for them. Like, perhaps this is more in keeping with hundreds of thousands of years of human existence than our more recent rigid past. And so I think there's a good call to be made for theologians being ones who help open the gates of revolution and free people from from strictures of rules of you can't do this or you can't do that around gender and sex.
In line with that, would you say, I know this is a question that gets posed, particularly in the context of other liberation theologies. Can Christianity be liberated? And does queer theology offer that pathway? Is that what you're suggesting? Or what do you think?
Is that a follow-up for me, or should I let one of my colleagues dive in first on that?
I think I'm not clear about the question. I think there needs to be some defining here. What do we mean by Christianity? First thing. Yeah, I mean, if I understood what the questioner meant by Christianity, that would really help me. Because I think Christianity, in terms of if we're thinking about the Christianity that we espouse in the text, and that might be idealistic, I think that is already beyond the text, also is already liberative. I think institutional Christianity needs a whole lot of work. And do I think it can be done? Institutional Christianity? No, I think this world will be working on that after I'm long gone. And the reason I say that is because I have a low anthropology. I think human beings are in our own imperfect way. Whenever two or more gathered, there is oppression and bigotry and other things that are happening, prejudice that are happening. And we need to be moved beyond ourselves, transformed, really transformed. Other people would say saved, but I would say transformed to be our better selves. And I don't know that of all of humanity that will take place in my lifetime. But I believe in the spiritual church, and I believe that is liberative already.
And I think I would add that part of the liberative nature is moving out of the idea of a singular Christianity, that we're looking at Christianities, that we're working within cultural contexts, that we're opening up ways that we have to be able to coexist in a variety of Christianities while working towards anti-oppressive states. So in that work, I think queer theology has a place, but again, if it's not done intersectionally, as I said at the beginning, it's not that queer folk don't oppress other people within the LGBTQIA+ community. It's others within society based on race, socioeconomic, citizenship, go down the line, all of these issues. I think it provides spaces to think about liberation, but at the same time brings its own challenges with it.
So most of you or all of you rather, are involved in activism outside of academia. Do you experience any tension in your roles between academic and activist? And what might those be?
I'll jump in on this one to begin. I would say I find the most tension coming from academia. There is a sense that for me, the work I do cannot happen. Anything scholarly I produce, what we're engaging in the classroom and in learning communities doesn't happen unless it's occurring on the ground as well. If I don't engage communities of accountability, my scholarship is meaningless. The academy, again, in a very white colonial trajectory, often looks down upon this, the idea of a scholar activist. The idea that you would put this work ahead is something that I'll say throughout the educational process and within universities. There's starting to be some movement towards recognizing that activism is part of scholarship, but there's still a big space to go in bridging these two and understanding that they aren't at odds, but actually for a lot of this work, especially those of us who are interested in queer work and liberatory work of any form, that it has to be done in community, which is something that we really have to break apart, this individualistic idea of what it means to do scholarship, whatever scholarship exactly is, but to actually be able to do it collectively is something that needs to definitely be worked on, to say the least.
So we have another question from the audience, putting it in the chat here, and I'll also read it out loud. Are you, and if so, how, expanding to LGBTQ2+ to honor the Two-Spirit Native American sisters and brothers?
Yes. I mean, I work, so I think it's important to work in the context that you're to start your work in a context that you're familiar with, and not to be pretentious about a context in which you know very little about. So for instance, while I think the best of my work is inclusive of all people, because that's liberation theology, I've written nothing that is specific to Indigenous persons, to First Nation people who are Two-Spirit. I've not done that work because I think that there is a voice that needs to, that I don't have the credentials or the expertise in that way, and to do that kind of work would exude a kind of arrogance that I don't have. I sit in those communities and I have conversations. I've had conversations with First Nations persons who are Two-Spirit persons, but I've not done any specific writing in that area. But I love to read in this area.
Yeah, I would say similar to what I said earlier about intersex. I don't necessarily, there are active debates about whether people people who identify as Two-Spirit see themselves, if this term means something fundamentally different than what we mean by sexual orientation and gender identity. So I want to respect those voices. I certainly include the voices of Two-Spirit people, both in writing, in video, in artwork, as guest speakers in courses I teach on queer and trans theologies, more than I would necessarily. I have a fear about continuing adding letters to the LGBTQ because inevitably you leave someone out and the terminology continues to evolve. And I think queer is an imperfect substitution, but I also think that yeah, I just wrestle with when I'm being inclusive and when I'm simply to assuage my guilt or my, meet my own desire to be deeply inclusive, whether that's actually what people want from me. So, and I'm aware of enough conversations in that community that makes that challenging. But those are the kind of conversations I think we should be listening to. And there's some really amazing artists and writers and thinkers and theologians from those communities who could better speak to that.
And can I just add that sometimes when the conversation, very often, not sometimes, very often, when the conversation comes up about Native Americans and Two-Spirit persons, it comes up from a white person who is really being very paternalistic. And I'm not saying that is necessarily the questioner here, but too often that's the root of that question comes from this context and the sense of, well, we just have to have a, kind of wrap our arms around everything and everyone. And I think that there's a way that attempt, Justin, I hear what you're saying. I will also say, I think that there's a way that attempt to be perfect in inclusion actually invisibilizes persons. If you all understand what I'm saying. And that is not, I'm not called to that. And I think that my work is better when I concentrate my work by biting off little pieces in the ways that I can do it most beautifully.
And I think what you're both bringing up too is this idea that we can model this ever and growing understanding of humanity in the variety, that we can hold on to the particular communities we work in, but to model whether it's in a congregation, in a community setting, in a classroom, where growing edges are is so important. Because if we go in and say, I know everything there is to know about the LGBTQ community, that is going to create a sense of people not feeling open to ask questions, to say, I don't know that. So the more we can also model space for people to continue this, that it is a dynamic thing. You don't go to a 2-day workshop at your church and know that you can check the I'm inclusive box, but how is it an ongoing project? And the more we can model that, the better.
Great. I have another question from the audience. I'll put it in the chat here. What role does the straight ally have in the work that you've been talking about this evening?
I'll say it's varied. Sometimes I struggle with the word ally. Sometimes it is a 4-letter word to me. The ways in which allyship becomes performative, that we put it up on social media, we put a pride flag in front of our church in June and say, I'm an ally. Something I really struggle with in the church in general is our apathy around inclusion. We have an apathy of inclusion. We have a welcoming statement. I come from the ELCA within the Lutheran tradition. We're really good at saying we are inclusive, regardless of gender, sexuality, race, and then say, why do we have a lot of straight folk? Why are we still a predominantly white denomination? Well, just saying it and not actually embodying it and doing it is an issue that we have to address within the church, and it's work that straight allies need to do. What does it mean to put your body on the line? What does it mean to show up? Right now, people's bodily autonomy is being threatened. What is your response to that? It's not just a self-education process, but for me, it's also a movement towards activism. And without the action going on in our congregations and communities, the idea of allyship is a really useless term for me unless it's followed up with something.
And also the questions suggested that only LGBTQ persons have a right to do this work. At least that's the way it feels when we all should be involved in this work. There's no difference between the role that I may have in advocating for justice, other than I identify as a queer lesbian. At the end of the day, I still have to show up at the voting booth. I still have to show up on the streets. I still have to do the writing. I still have to advocate in my church. These are all things that we all should be doing. Do I have a bigger platform? Yeah, but I think, you know, than some people, yeah, probably, because I've been so intentional about the work. I want to believe that it's because of my intentionality towards the work and not merely who I am. And I think that any and everybody, if we think about it that way, can do the work. And the last thing I want to say is that it is important for us to use our gifts and talents in the best ways that we can. So as my church is going through schism right now, I could very easily just stay in the academy and be an activist on the streets. I decided that I would also serve as a part-time interim pastor at an affirming church, because I can preach a little. And that's a gift and a skill set of mine. And I wanted to do that because I don't want our affirming churches to suffer for lack of ministerial leadership during this time. And so the question became for me, so what are you going to do? How are you going to help during this time? And I think that's the question for straight allies. So what are you going to do? How are you going to use your gifts and skills during these times? So that is a question that can be easily asked by every individual. What you can do will be different. So I don't think we will have a perfect answer for that question, as much as I would like one, because it depends upon the individual and their gifts and talents. But by all means, please do all you can in the time that you have to do it, because we are careening towards losing this democracy.
And I would also say that for straight allies who recognize that our liberation is bound together, like, when a young Black trans woman is respected and safe on the streets and able to get a job and love who she loves, then all of us will have those rights. And so I think until we recognize, I am continually moved by straight people in my queer and trans theologies class who cry because they've never been exposed to ideas about what their life could be, who, in a really positive way, are moved by saying, like, I never dreamed of these possibilities. And so when they recognize that our liberation is deeply connected with their liberation, then people can act from a place of solidarity, of comradeship, in a way that moves us all forward together.
So we're going to open the floor now to closing remarks. What is it that you would like us to walk away with? Is there anything that has gone unsaid, questions that weren't posed that you are dying to answer? Just share with us your closing remarks. And if you have a couple of tidbits in there about where maybe we could go for resources that you would recommend to answer some of these questions as we go forward and what we do next, that would be appreciated.
Dr. Whipple, no, actually, I think Dr. Sabia-Tanis, you went last first. So why don't you go first this time, and we'll go in reverse order.
Okay. Let's see, there's 2 points I want to make. One is, I want to draw in Marcella Altos Reed's idea of indecent theology, which is challenging to understand. But I think, part of the message that queer theology brings, is that by playing by the rules of decency of the church, of following the lines of all having decorum, a word with significant meaning in these couple of weeks, right? We fail the God who is wild and unpredictable and loving and ununderstandable and ineffable. There's a facet of God that we fundamentally do not understand because we're trying to follow decent theology. And part of what she advocated for was that we have to be disrespectful to theologies that are not theologies of liberation, but are theologies of oppression. And I think one thing that queer theology can raise is this need to disrespect that which is harming, that need to that we can liberate Christianity in part by saying that God is a wild and fierce and lovely God that is not playing by these rules. And that's important for us theologically. The other point that we haven't raised that I wanted to bring up is the fact that the LGBTQ communities are far less likely to be Christian than other demographics in our society, and that young people are leaving the church, as we all know, in large numbers. And I want to say that one place that we can be true to the mission of the church without necessarily the decency or the established order of the church, which is to say that when queer people were thrown out of churches, we created our own spaces and spiritual sanctuaries in places like, radical lesbian communities, the radical fairies. We've created churches, we've created synagogues, we've created all these spaces. We have, my dissertation was on the work of queer artists because they document spirituality that exists outside of religious institutions. And we would do really well to study the ways in which groups have formed queer spiritualities, communities, support communities, which take very seriously the movement of God in the world and the building of community, and say, what can we learn from? How will the church of the 21st century or the spiritual communities of the 21st century minister in meaningful ways to people, the meaning of life, about whether we're going to survive on this planet, about what a person is called to do, what are we responsible for, how are we responsible to one another, how do we rehumanize, all of these deeply meaningful questions. Instead of saying how do we get more people in the pews, how do we really say people have left the church, but they've discovered God out there, or they've brought God with them. God never leaves us, even if religious institutions try to force people out. And so I just think there's deep richness in the queer communities that is a source of knowing and inspiration and joy for people of faith. And I hope our theologies continue to push in the direction of engaging that.
So I wish we had more time to talk about politics here. As we speak, 2 Black men have just been reseated to their positions in Tennessee. And as we sit, laws are being written to harm people in our country, to keep immigrants from pursuing citizenship, to take away the choice of women to say what they want to do with their bodies, and to fight people who harm them. So I'm trying to open this. I would love for us to be able to open this up so that we connect more between our queerness and the world of politics, which so often governs our embodied existence here in this nation. Everything that we want, and I'm concerned because much of what we want to do, our commitment to liberation, cannot happen without a strong commitment to educating ourselves about the politics of our land. So many people don't know how a bill comes into being voted upon. And we need those in order to survive as a community and as a nation. So I really wish we could have maybe done some theopolitics from a queer perspective. Historically, we've survived in civil rights movements because our leaders stepped outside the church. We had a lot of conversation about Christianity. They stepped outside the church to do the work that needed to happen. They came from the church, but they saw the church as ineffective for the goal of liberation. That's a sad commentary, but it's a true commentary. You know, Malcolm X at one point in time was a member of the church, and yet he saw the weaknesses of Christianity as it was being articulated and lived out. And so I really wish we could have had a little more conversation about politics and how politics is governing the world in which we live. Ecology, economics, having a class analysis that is really undergirded by queer theology and queer theory would have been really interesting to me. And then finally, I will say this, I'm always interested in how these conversations are set up because I'm such a community person. While I appreciate the webinar, it would have really helped me to see the faces of the community so that we wouldn't just simply be talking heads in these little pods, but we would have that sense of speaking to a fuller community. So these things, I'm always interested in how activists and progressives set up the conversations. That's my 2 pennies, maybe more.
And I'll add to these wonderful thoughts. First, a hope that we continue to work to be translators of liberation into our communities, into the political spheres, into our activist spheres. How do we bring our understandings, those of us coming from Christian commitments, into this place and give a different view of what it means to be a follower of Jesus in our world than what is usually seen within the media right now, and the way that particularly queer perspectives on this open that space up. And following what Justin was saying too, this idea of breaking open what we understand of sacred space. How do we support these spaces that are life-giving, whether or not they are within the confines of communities that we would hope them to be? So how do we see and support what is going on in our lesbian, gay, queer bars right now? The sacred space that is there as those spaces continue to be targeted, as we saw with Club Q, with Pulse, financially also the ways they're being shut. How do we continue to open up these sacred spaces that people can recognize each other's humanity and possibly God in the midst of that? And also, how do we support those who are doing this work, whether it is our activist organizations, our queer scholars, many of whom are often underfunded. And this is a very practical piece of it, of how do we ensure organizations like Infleshed, like Queer Theology, who are doing this work and making things accessible to communities, are supported by us and the communities that we are connected to.
Is there any other closing remarks before we turn it over to Dr. Lovelace? Okay, Dr. Lovelace, could you close us?
Thank you. Excuse me. And first, I just want to say thank you to our panelists. It was such an enriching conversation. I hope it is not the first. I hope it is one among several ongoing conversations, both at Lancaster Seminary and Moravian Theological Seminary and Moravian University, of which we are a part. I want to thank the Diversity and Educational Life Committee that sponsored this, that brought this panel together. Just how much were we enriched by having Dr. Pamela Lightsey and Dr. Karri Whipple and Dr. Justin Sabia-Tanis to speak to us from these different perspectives, but there were certainly overlapping at times, but also to recognize the differences in their theological approaches to queer theology and queer perspectives. But I wanted to note that some of the things that certainly they talked about was intersectionality and how, whether it's race or gender or politics, that it, and religion certainly work together or impact how one receives and interacts with queer or trans identified people. That liberation, that it should be liberative, that it is justice oriented. If it is done well, as you noted, that some people can be LGBTQIA+ and racist. And so we certainly appreciate them naming that to be justice is to, again, to be inclusive as well. And so breaking down barriers is really what kind of tied all of the panel discussions together. The opportunities, the boundaries, the limitations, certainly. But again, that this is just the beginning of what I hope are continuous conversations across campuses in the classrooms. And hopefully we get to having these in our churches as well. The Diversity and Educational Life Committee, which is chaired by Dr. Julius O'Brien, who you met during the beginning. But I also want to name the members of the Diversity and Educational Life Committee. We have Equilla Curry, Carol Moore, Bambi Galore, Tom Rim, Tony Fields, and Teresa Benayan. The committee consists of students, faculty, staff, and alums. And so it brings a rich diversity of perspectives to the issues around diversity and inclusion and anti-racism on our campus. I also wanted to thank our fabulous moderators for doing such a wonderful job, Dr. Beth Toler and LTS student Rachel Compton-Monell. Just a marvelous job of keeping things flowing and engaging the questions from the audience. And I don't want to leave here without noting a comment from someone in the audience that may God bless you all for the exercised courage and willingness to take on this wonderful challenge. Certainly, this is hard work. Activism is hard work. It takes a large toll on one's body, spirituality. It is not easy work. And so we thank you for bringing your activism, your scholarship, your faith, and all of the ways that you present yourselves, pastors, in the space that you work in. And so with that, I see that Dr. O'Brien is back. Did you have any last words, Dr. O'Brien?
No, we thank you for being here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. May the work continue.